Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome to Creating Meaningful Products, which is a workshop that's going to be focused on product management, what it is, what they do, and then how we can create great products and be great product managers. I guess just to preface. Hello, everyone. Thank you for Just to preface this, you don't need any prior knowledge or experience within product management to learn something from this workshop. This will be pretty introductory, so I still hope that I can provide you guys with some value about what product management is and whether or not you have any prior knowledge. And if you do, hopefully you'll be able to gain something from the workshop that you didn't know about product management. So moving on to a little bit about me, my name is Selena, and I'm currently in my final year here at the University of Waterloo. I'm studying computer engineering, and I've currently had around like 6 internships with Waterloo. So just to start off, through my academic career, I started in IT, working as a junior network administrator, and then I kind of went the route of like software engineering and development. I worked as a software engineer for a fintech company, as well as a full stack developer, and then this is kind of where I began to explore product management. And then I worked as a product management intern for Purolator, and then more recently, I worked as a product management intern over the summer for Unity Technologies. So I kind of have a little bit of experience in each of the different fields that kind of lead up to product management. And I think that during my kind of journey into product management, I got a lot of experience from the outside looking in at product, which really gained my interest and then prompted me to learn more about it and then eventually pursue more internships within product. So this is the agenda for the workshop. I'm going to start by going into what is product management, and then I'm going to go into product strategy and how that ties into product management. I'll be showing you guys a framework on how decision makers like product managers create successful products. And then finally, I wanted to talk about something that I have like a little bit of experience in, as well as give you guys an insight into the types of activities that product managers do on a day-to-day. So we'll be talking about customer interviews and then finally putting one together ourselves. So starting with what product management is. Product management is essentially a process that focuses on bringing a new product to market or developing an existing one. It's basically the intersection between business, user experience, and technology. So when we talk about like these three main sections, from a business perspective, product management helps teams achieve their business objectives. They need to help bridge the communication gap between development, design, the customer, and the business. From a UX perspective or user experience perspective, product managers focus on the user experience. They represent the customer inside of the organization. It's important for product managers to gain empathy for their users to understand their needs and their pain points. And then finally, from a technology or technical perspective, product managers also need to understand what happens from a technical point of view. They need to, in order to determine feasibility, timelines, and properly communicate with engineers. So product managers kind of need to be well versed in all three of these categories, and they need to be able to communicate with people and experts in all three of these categories. So they kind of sit at the center and bridge the gap between these three groups. So there's a couple main areas of focus when we talk about what a product manager does and their main activities. A product manager is a person who creates internal and external product vision and leads product development from scratch. Product managers participate in various activities depending on the stage of the project that they're working on. So the first area is identifying opportunities. So as a product manager, you need to keep up to date with current events and trends to identify opportunities and create a product or improve an existing product. The next would be developing product vision and strategy. So developing a long-term mission and roadmaps to detail a clear, realistic plan and a desired result. So this one's interesting because when you work in different organizations and you have a company with their own missions and their goals, a product manager is kind of like a mini CEO, essentially. They're working on a product, but not only does it need to align with the product itself and their success, but it also needs to align with the company's success. So if the mission of a product doesn't align with the mission of the company, there's going to be misalignment within teams within the company. So product managers need to act as like mini CEOs for a product that align with the bigger visions of the company. The next main area of focus is teams and stakeholder management. So managing expectations from different stakeholders, as well as effectively communicating with team members. Marketing activities, doing market research, observing current trends, collecting and analyzing customer feedback, defining pricing, and developing a market strategy. So essentially doing the research to ensure the success of a product. At the end of the workshop, we're going to be doing a customer interview together, or kind of figuring out what's wrong within a customer interview that I created. And this kind of ties into marketing activities because you really want to understand your user as a product manager. And then finally, constant product improvement. A product manager's job isn't done when a product has been shipped. There's constant improvement and working on existing products, testing it, analyzing data, and then managing defects. So sometimes it can get a little confusing when we talk about what product managers do on a day-to-day. When you ask a product manager in the field, they'll mostly tell you that their day-to-day looks very different all the time. I remember when I first started looking at product management and I had a lot of coffee chats with different ones, asking them what they did on a day-to-day, I'd always get a different answer. The answer always kind of stayed around like every day is different, and depending on the product that you work on, the activities and roles that you're doing on a day-to-day are very different. So when I first started in the role, I was very curious as to like what specifically a product manager does every day. And the answer is like correct to what I heard in the coffee chats. So depending on like the stage at which a product is in its product life cycle, the activities that a product manager does can differ very greatly. So starting with number one, when we look at like discover and a product that's in its discovery phase, this is essentially a product that hasn't been built yet and it hasn't even been thought of yet. So it's a product that is kind of still being like thought out or still being found. So as a product manager, during this stage, you need to understand pain points, competitors, industry trends, and internal goals to discover what you're trying to build. In the second part, so defining is essentially defining the detailed requirements that goes into the product. So you have what you want to build, you have an idea, what does it take to build that minimum viable product or that MVP. So as a product manager, you're going to be detailing requirements, looking at what resources are needed, looking at specifications, and looking at what's feasible and what's not. The third kind of step is validating. So you have what you're going to build, you have the specifications, but is this a good idea or is this not a good idea? So this is where product managers will talk to users, validate the intended proposed project, prototype, and designs. Number four is implementing. So this is kind of where you get engineers, BAs, QAs, you get like a more cross-functional team involved in the work that you're doing. So essentially during the stage, product managers will be like aligning, motivating, enabling, and leading a cross-functional team to build a product. So they need to be aware of specifications, but they also need to communicate with business analysts and engineers well-versed in both areas. They need to be able to communicate cross-functionally and communicate like very technical like pieces to the business side, and then vice versa. Following this is launch. So if a product is ready to be launched, you need to make it available to customers. So these are things like the go-to-market strategy. How can we get a product out to our customer segment in a way that will reach many people, will attract new customers, but also retain the ones that we already have? So putting together a marketing strategy for this. And then finally, measuring. So the product's been shipped, it's out to the public. What did we do well? What didn't we do well? Let's define some KPIs or key performance indicators to determine whether or not this product was successful. So these are kind of like the 6 different steps to what it takes to kind of build a product. And depending on where the product is that a product manager is working on, the activities that they partake in are going to be very different. I also wanted to talk about like the difference between product and project management, because I think that this is something that sometimes these roles get confused because they both focus on like working with people and working in cross-functional teams. And sometimes the skills needed for both project and product managers are pretty similar. So starting with the definition of product versus project, a product refers to what you are providing to a group of users. So it can be anything from like a physical product to software or a service, and it satisfies the needs of a group of users. A project is a one-time endeavor with the aim of creating a product or service. It has a start date, an end date, and then a defined outcome. So a product is not temporary. It changes and it evolves as the needs of the users changes and evolves, but therefore projects can be a part of a product and building a product. Product managers own strategy, releases, ideation, features, go-to-market, and profit and loss. So they're responsible for meeting the needs of users through the development of a minimal viable product or an MVP. And whereas product managers own budget, delivery, resources, capacity, problem resolution, and status updates. Their responsibility is to successfully bring a project to completion within an agreed budget, time, and quality. So both project and product managers can also work together in an organization. You don't need like one or the other. They can potentially work on the same things, but they just see them through different lenses. So moving on to product strategy. Product strategy is essentially an integrated set of choices that uniquely positions the firm in its industry so as to create sustainable advantage and superior value relative to the competition. So what does this mean? Product strategy is essentially just a set of choices that an organization or a product manager can make in order to determine what type of product that they want to build and how they want to build it. So product strategy is essentially like a relatively new field, and it was previously known as management. So prior to kind of like defining what product strategy is, and defining product strategy as an actual role, managers would be the ones to kind of like decide what product a company is going to be making and whether or not they did any research or decided to like analyze any markets before they decided what to build was completely up to them. Product strategy essentially provides organizations with more specifically product managers with a set of choices that make it that allow them to think of a detailed mission and plan for a product. So one thing to point out is that this isn't really like a simple task. Answering these questions is actually pretty difficult. So making these decisions requires research, cross-functional teamwork, experts in various fields, and recommendations from a variety of stakeholders. Product managers shouldn't make decisions about a product based on intuition or gut or whatever they feel like making. These questions are supposed to help guide research plans, conduct customer interviews, analyze current data, to ensure that what they're building will positively affect their organization. So answering these questions will allow organizations to kind of think of aspects of the product that they may have missed if they had not done so prior. So one part of like product strategy is the choice cascade, and these are essentially like the choices or the questions that you should ask when you're trying to build a product. So this is essentially the set of questions provided by the product strategy framework. It's called the choice cascade because it starts with one question: what is our winning aspiration? And then based on the answer to this question, it'll affect the next question, which is where will we play? This is essentially a set of 5 questions, which is pretty high level. There's not many specifics, so whatever these questions mean to the organization is purely up to them. They can be as detailed as they like to be, or they can be as vague as they'd like to be when they're kind of answering these five questions. The first question is, what is our winning aspiration? Which essentially means, what would it look like if the product that we are trying to build is successful? The next is, where will we play? So in which geography, product category, customer segment, and channel are we going to play in? This also helps determine like where are we not going to play, which is sometimes hard for organizations to do. When we talk about where we're not going to play, we're kind of like eliminating a certain customer segment, a certain geography, a certain channel, and that can be hard because as an organization, you kind of want to aim for everything. So where will we play answers where we are, but also where we aren't going to be participating. Next is, how will we win? So what is the value we'll be adding to customers, and how does that compare to our competitors? What capabilities must be in place can refer to activities that an organization can do to ensure that a product is successful. So does extra research need to be done? Do we need experts in different fields working on the project, etc.? And then finally, management systems. What management systems are required? So this means that can we create KPIs or set up systems to analyze the success of a product? So all of these questions put together make up the choice cascade, which product managers can use in those beginning phases of building a product in order to solution out the product that they'd like to build. So next we're going to be talking about customer interviews. What are they, and then why are they important? So customer interviews are a research method often used by product managers to deepen their understanding of how their users interact with a certain product. I wanted to include a section about customer interviews within the workshop to really help with understanding the importance of gaining empathy for users as a product manager. Customer interviews can be found at many different stages in the product development lifecycle, and they can be useful in many different ways. In my past experiences, I've seen how successful interviews are put together and how they can impact the creation of successful products. So why are they important? The first reason I think that why customer interviews are important is they help understanding the customer. We talked about how PMs are kind of like the spokesperson of customers within an organization, and doing customer interviews helps PMs learn about their customers, their lives, the types of people that are driven to products, and it helps them gain empathy by learning about who actually uses their products. The next reason is customer interviews help in the understanding of pain points. By speaking directly to customers, PMs can learn how users interact with their product, but also how they can find pain points within the conversation that they may have missed through other means of research. Having conversations with users allows PMs to pry and dig deeper into topics candidly, which could help with the discovery of new pain points. Customer interviews also essentially help guide organizations to create products or features based on what their users say. Organizations could rely heavily on this input, as many companies and PM should be user-focused. And then finally, they're important because they help understand the impact that a product can have on a customer's life. When we talk about building products, not only are there like fun and leisure software products, but there's also software products out there that help create meaningful impacts in people's lives. For example, food delivery services or software applications focused on housing. So interviewing customers also can tell organizations how their product is changing the lives of their users and seeing if this aligns with their intended missions as an organization. So how do they work? When I first started doing customer interviews, I think that I definitely underestimated the amount of work that needed to go into kind of like putting together an interview and why it was so important. But there's essentially work that needs to be done in preparation, during the interview, and then even after the interview, in order to kind of get like reap the full rewards of doing customer interviews. So starting with preparation, the first thing you need to do is like know your audience and know your participants. When we talk about having participants for customer interviews, this means you're taking time out of your user's day in order to interview them to make your product better. So making sure you're doing your homework and collecting background knowledge where it is available so that you understand and you're educated about who you're talking to and why they would agree to do an interview with you. Next would be defining clear goals. So what is your main objective and what are you trying to accomplish? Customer interviews can be used for many different things, and there can be many different types of customer interviews. So making sure that you have like an end goal of what you want to get out of the interview is pretty important. And then finally, planning your questions. So plan what direction you want your interview to be geared towards. This is a conversation between two people. So sometimes you can veer off topic, or maybe the interviewee has something that they'd like to say that is pretty off topic. So planning your questions and knowing your direction ahead of time will help you stay on track and like really get to that end goal. During the interview, there's a couple things that like need to be kept in mind. So the first thing is being aware of bias. So are you steering the conversation unintentionally? Are your questions that you're asking do they have like some sort of bias in them? And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Next is like sticking to your plan, but being adaptable to flexibility. So kind of what I just said, during a conversation with two people, sometimes you can kind of get off track, and sometimes it's okay to kind of veer off topic. If an interviewee feels really strongly about something, let's say they hate an aspect of the product that you're building, or they feel really strongly about something, sometimes it's okay to veer off track because that could be something really useful for you or another team within the organization, and collecting that feedback is still really important. But still making sure that you still have your plan and you're still referring to the questions that you have, but allowing the conversation to kind of flow in a natural direction. And then referring to your goal frequently. So as a reminder, making sure that you are aware of what you want to get out of the interview so that you can kind of like tailor your questions and steer the conversation in a way that is intended. And then afterwards, so after you've kind of like done all of these customer interviews, analyzing the data that is collected is something that is pretty important. And I think that this is something that's recommended to do in like a team to avoid bias. So you can obviously have like a whole set of interviews that you've conducted and then try to analyze this data yourself. But as somebody, for example, a product manager working on a product, it might be useful to kind of have like extra people there analyzing the data so that you don't miss anything or you're not using your bias to kind of jump to conclusions. coming up with key findings and an action plan based on your conclusions. So making sure that like the end goal that you had, or the goal that you had in the beginning, was answered, and you were able to kind of like answer the questions that you wanted to. And then presenting your findings in a clear and cohesive way. Interviews take time. When we talk about doing customer interviews, not only do you need to prepare, do the interviews, and then analyze the data after, it also takes a lot of time to like find these users that are agreeing to do the interviews with you. Sometimes like it could take really long to get like a couple people, and also depending on the amount of people you'd like to interview, it can vary. So making sure that you present your findings in a clear and cohesive way so that people down the line in the organization can use this data to kind of like support their own findings. So moving on to like do's and don'ts of interviews. The first do, or the first thing that you should kind of like keep in mind, and this kind of ties into the exercise we'll be doing after this. So do ask open-ended questions. So you want to start questions in an interview with like what and how instead of how many or do you. You want the answer to be more than one word long. So asking questions that start with what and how are very open-ended, and allows the interviewee to kind of steer the conversation in any direction that they want. The next is like ask follow-up questions. Sometimes users in interviews are pretty shy, or sometimes they like don't really want to talk a lot. So asking follow-up questions allows you to prepare or kind of like pry deeper based on the information that you've received. If you ask a question and they didn't really answer it the way that you wanted, having a set of follow-up questions kind of prepared will help you kind of like nitpick at the little things that they said so that they can open up about some things. So for example, if a user brings up a problem but they don't really want to talk about it a lot, asking specifically about that problem will allow them to, and what they like or their feelings about the problem, what they did to mitigate this problem, and things like that will allow you to dig deeper as the interviewer without them kind of like having to do that on their own. The next do is like help users feel comfortable. So you don't want to ask any like really personal questions or really like demanding questions that requires a lot about like their personal life or things that they're uncomfortable answering. You want to make sure that like you introduce yourself in a way that is polite. You thank them for your time, and then you make sure that you know that like they can answer questions that they'd like to, but they can also skip questions that they'd like to. A user's taking like time out of their day to do the interview for you and with you. So just making sure that they feel comfortable, and that'll also help them kind of like open up within the interview. And then the last do, which is kind of like counterintuitive, is embracing silence. So when you ask a question, instead of kind of like filling that gap of that silence or like that awkward pause with like you rephrasing the question or adding extra comments, you just want to embrace the silence. You kind of want to just sit there and let the interviewee think about the question. And this is like pretty awkward, and it was something that I like had some trouble with in the beginning when I first started doing interviews, because you kind of want to fill that space. But embracing silence is kind of like the best thing that you can do, because one, it allows the user to think, but it also avoids bias. So when you kind of rephrase a question, you're more at risk for like rephrasing it in a way that's more easy for you to understand, which could be biased. So kind of like embracing that silence, asking your question one time, and then giving the user like maybe even like a minute or two to think is like not as awkward as you think it is. Moving on to some don'ts. So the first don't is don't ask leading questions. So don't try to answer the question within the question itself. For example, what do you like about X, Y, and Z? Or what do you hate about A, B, and C? These questions, though they may seem not biased, it actually kind of like that beginning part, what do you hate and what do you like, has that preconceived notion that like you should hate this part or you should like this part, which is a little bit of bias. The next thing you shouldn't do is ask users what they specifically want. Users don't know what they want. As a product manager, it's your job to figure out what they want. So not asking users for like recommendations. What should we do because you hate X, Y, and Z? What should we do because you love this part of our product? It's not the user's job. And like the whole point of the interview is to kind of like gauge why they like something so that you can build something better. The next don't is asking yes or no questions. You don't want to ask yes or no questions because it doesn't really tell you anything other than yes or no. You can rephrase yes or no questions or ask them as follow-ups, but asking just a yes or no question kind of takes time out of the interview, and it doesn't really give you much information. And the next don't is mentioning other users in the interview. For example, a lot of people say X, Y, and Z. Do you agree? It kind of also kind of ties into bias. So you don't want to make them kind of fall into the opinions of others because a lot of people said one thing. And it also kind of like takes the focus away from them as a user. We don't want to talk about like the other users we've been talking to, what they're saying, and why you as a user should be saying the same thing. And then the final don't is like asking loaded questions. So a lot of questions in one sentence or like a lot of questions in the same phrase. Typically, since an interviewee is kind of nervous, they're only going to answer like the first and the last question or the questions that they can remember. So splitting them up into like many different questions or asking one more open-ended question is kind of a better way to phrase some of the questions within your interview. Okay, so we're gonna go into like a customer interview development exercise. But before we start, is there any questions that we have? Okay, seems like we're okay. So I am going to be, there is a link for a Google Doc that I put together. So let me just share that with you guys. Okay, so a link was sent and it's essentially like a Google Doc. So feel free to click it. And I think you'll remain anonymous. I guess it doesn't really matter, but it's essentially a research plan that I put together, and the main focus of the research plan is should universities continue to host online classes post pandemic. So the purpose, I've included a purpose, users, an introduction, and some very, very high level preliminary questions. And the goal of this exercise is to kind of nitpick some of the things that I did wrong during this, putting this together. So based on like the do's and don'ts that I kind of talked about, for example, like avoiding bias, making sure that you're not asking yes or no questions. What are some things that I did wrong here that maybe we can fix? And then the second kind of part of the exercise is putting together some better questions, some unbiased questions, and some questions that kind of like touch on things that I didn't touch on, kind of like improving this current research plan. So I'm just going to go through like the purpose, the objective, the users, and then I think all of you have edit access. So feel free to comment in like Hopin or Slido, or you can comment directly into the Google slide and we can kind of discuss some of the things that I did wrong within the interview. So the first thing, kind of going over the purpose and objective. So the purpose of this interview is to determine whether or not universities should continue to host online classes for students following COVID-19 restrictions. And then for users, we'll be interviewing current university students, those in upper year with prior class experience, and newer students who have only had online university experience thus far. So in my introduction, this is what I would say to the user. Hi, blank. My name is Selena. I wanted to sit down with you today to speak about your experience at the University of Waterloo and your opinions about how COVID-19 has impacted your learning experience. Please make sure to answer all questions with extreme detail. We'd love to hear about your personal or private experiences as well. So does anyone see anything wrong or something that can be potentially improved with this, with the introduction? Let's try that link. Sorry. I think you guys had viewing access, so maybe try that. So I guess starting with like the introduction, does anyone see anything wrong with the introduction? Like if this was how I was like addressing a user that was like taking time out of their day to do a user interview, what would be wrong with kind of like saying this to them? Yeah, so the last sentence in the intro could be changed. Yep. And then we can make it a little bit more comfortable. It feels a little formal. So those are both correct. So the last sentence is actually pretty, I would say, kind of rude. When we say something like, please hear, like, I want to hear about your personal private experiences as like, please, like, that's a little bit more, a little too straightforward. It could like kind of like make a user feel uncomfortable to answer like interview questions going forward. And it kind of makes them kind of like shy away from like some of the questions. Yes. Another kind of like aspect of this is we didn't thank them for their time. They're taking time out of their day to do this interview. If you're from an organization, you want to make sure that you're like really appreciative of the people that are willing to help you. So making sure that you kind of like thank them for their time. Anything else? I might feel uncomfortable. Yeah, you have high expectations, so you're kind of expecting the user to answer everything in the perfect way, and you're making this very clear to them, so it might make them seem like they're not going to be able to do it and kind of like shy away from answering the questions. Exactly. So we'll go through I guess what are ways that we can kind of change this. We'll do that first before going into like the actual questions. So is there anything that we could potentially say instead of this last sentence that would kind of make them feel a little bit more comfortable? Okay, we can come back to it. I think that improving this part may not be as important as the rest of the interview questions. So moving on to kind of like the introduction or preliminary questions, I see people kind of like getting started with that. But the three questions that I thought of for this really short interview is, what do you go to the University of Waterloo? What program are you in? And then how much do you like going here? Yeah. So, Sammy, you were on the right track. So, not an open question. What university do you go to is like way better. Yes or no questions don't answer a lot. And then another thing to think about when we ask this question, like, do you go to the University of Waterloo? This should be like something that you could have found beforehand about the person in order to properly do your research about like the customer, the user you're interviewing, right? So you kind of like this is kind of like homework that you could have done beforehand. So, kind of asking this question, there's not really a point to asking this question. The same thing with what program are you in? It is like kind of it's closed. It only requires like one sentence, and then it also is something that you could have found beforehand. What do you like about going here? Yep, leading question. So exactly, like what if they hate going to that specific school? What if they dislike it? When you ask something like, "How do you like X, Y, and Z?" It is like the preconceived notion that like why do you you're supposed to like it and why. So focusing on introduction questions, like what else could we have asked in place of these three questions? Sammy, you are on the right track. So how do you feel about your university? Is there anything else that you guys think would like help in like an introduction to answering the question of like what should universities continue to host online classes post pandemic? So as an introduction question, what do you think would be like important to ask somebody when you're just kind of starting out the interview? So another thing that you could potentially ask is basically like, how do you feel about your university experience, or how has your university experience been thus far? And another question could essentially just be, tell me about yourself. So telling me about yourself will allow you to answer those two questions. Which university do you go to? And then what program that you're in? But it also gives you it also gives the user a chance to kind of like figure out what they other things that they kind of want to talk about when they talk about themselves, which could give you kind of like a little bit more background about them. Like they'll probably answer the questions of the program that they're in and the school that they go to, so you'll get that information, but also allows them to kind of like steer that conversation in a way that they intend to. So moving on to like remote learning, the two questions that I thought of, like, how many classes did you take online? And a lot of students hated remote learning. What do you think? Yep. So biased not towards not liking remote learning. You don't know if the person hates or likes remote learning. So by asking it like this, it kind of gives them the intention that they should hate remote learning, and then they don't. Kunal, yeah, they are pretty similar. Sorry, I think that I was just kind of like listing out some potential questions that you could ask in place of the like preliminary ones. So in terms of remote learning, so question one, a lot of students hated remote learning. Yep, that one's biased. Does anyone see anything wrong with like remote number one? How many classes did you take online? So this question is pretty bad because it is like a one word answer as well. So how many classes did you take online? They'll answer that in like 2 seconds, and then it doesn't really give you any background to anything. What could we ask in replacement of these questions? So how can we phrase question number two in a way that is not biased? So one way we could do it is saying something like, tell me about tell me about your experience in a remote learning environment. So this is a way to kind of like unbiasedly ask, what did you think about remote learning, without kind of putting in your intention of like if you hated it or if you loved it. This also is an open-ended question. It allows them to kind of provide a little bit of an explanation, and then steer the conversation in the way that they want. It's not leading, and it's not like a one-word answer. So Belle, exactly. Like, what are your thoughts on remote learning? Exactly. Moving on to in-person learning. So the three questions that I came up with: have you ever been to campus? Where did you specifically live in Waterloo? And how much more enjoyable was learning in person? Sammy, you got it again. It's a leading question. The first two questions, does anyone see anything wrong with asking someone where they specifically lived in Waterloo? Or I guess like a specific address in Waterloo? So question number two, I see someone on question number one, so I'll let them comment. But question number two, I would say is not like an appropriate question to ask because it is uncomfortable. That information shouldn't give you any like background information or help you figure out the end goal of the research plan. Should universities continue to host classes online? Asking someone where they specifically live is like kind of an uncomfortable question, and it shouldn't be asked. And then, have you ever been to campus? Oh, did somebody? Yeah, have you ever been to campus? It should be background knowledge. It should be something that you should have seen when you were kind of doing your research. But it's also like a yes or no question as well. It doesn't really tell you much. It doesn't really give them a chance to explain. So for these questions, what are some other questions that we can ask in replacement for these two questions? So the first question could be similar to the other one. So tell me about your experience with online learning. In person, sorry, learning environment. Yep. So personal information that they might be sharing, they may not feel comfortable sharing that. And then, according to kind of like the beginning, the introduction that I shared, I didn't exactly state that they could miss questions that they were uncomfortable or didn't feel comfortable answering, which is something that you should always do in kind of like the beginning of an introduction. You should always say like, feel free to skip any questions that you don't feel comfortable sharing. So this question is kind of like pushing it, but also it wasn't stated in the beginning. Okay, I guess we can come back to some replacements if we have time. But the last section is like a comparison or reflection question. So kind of like at the end, what are some things like extra things that we want to know about this person and how they feel about in-person versus online classes? So the first question is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you like remote learning? So Sammy said, doesn't state if one is bad or good exactly. So it's not a very clear question. It's also something that can be phrased in a very different way. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you like remote learning? They can easily say 3, and then they could be done with the question. This has the potential to be a very open-ended question, but the way that it was asked doesn't really give you much of an explanation as to why they hated it or why they liked it. It's just like a one-word answer that gives you no background. Question number 2, if you could choose remote learning or in-person learning, which one would you choose? Eliminates the hybrid option, which is a real possibility. Yeah, it kind of gives them like a one or the other, which isn't exactly the way it needs to be. Anything else with this one? Yeah, okay, so if you could choose remote learning or in-person learning, which one would you choose? Again, it's still like a kind of closed-ended question. It doesn't ask why. There's no follow-ups to this question. It could just be like a one-word answer. And then finally, what do you think about the university should do going forward? Exactly. So users don't know what they want. It's better to ask ask for their opinions on possible routes, and they're focused on previous actions. They'll be bad at predicting what they will do. Exactly. So you can't really ask users, what should we do as a university? It's not really fair to them. And it's also kind of like an overwhelming question. So kind of just asking for their opinions is the best that you can get out of a customer interview. Asking for specific recommendations can also kind of be seen as unprofessional. It's not their job to answer the question of what you should do. So this question, I think, should just kind of be like eliminated altogether. So replacements for these questions. So what can we ask in replacement for these questions? And I think that we can kind of embody these in just like one question. What's an open-ended way to kind of like combine question 1 and 2? So one way that we could ask could be, doesn't need to be a super complicated question, but I think that the main point is that you want to be unbiased with the question and you want to also make sure that it's open ended. So asking why is kind of like a way to make sure that you're getting an explanation for that one word answer that they're going to provide you. Which one do you prefer and why is kind of like a very simple way to say it, but it kind of gets rid of that like hard stop at the end of a question. Oh, I like in person. Next question, you know? So just asking things and making sure that it's open ended, and then that every response that you can get are is essentially something that like will require more than one sentence from the user is pretty important. Oh, still ignores that hybrid option. You're right. Can you think of another way to ask this to put in the hybrid option into that? I completely missed that. This could be a potential like added question in order to kind of get like the hybrid approach. So how might you feel with the blended approach from learning to learning from the university? This doesn't necessarily ask for like a recommendation or like should we have a blended approach, but it just like asks the users what their personal opinion about the blended approach is. And I think that could complement the first question pretty well as well, instead of kind of just like combining both of those in like one really long or like open-ended question. Asking about their opinions and feelings, and then making sure that it's not like a closed-ended question. What kind of learning environment? What kind of learning environment would you be comfortable learning in? But then we assume that the user knows what they want. I think that necessarily that's okay. When we assume that the user kind of knows what they want, that should be okay. It's just like the user doesn't know what the university wants or like what the university should do. So we do want to ask questions that allow them to kind of like say what they want and say some of their own opinions. It's just when we ask for recommendations, like what should Waterloo do about this? That's kind of where we kind of touch on like them providing recommendations and doing their work for us. But we do want to know like what they like and what they don't and their opinions. So this question that you asked, what kind of learning environment would you be comfortable learning in, is really good. And I think that would provide a lot of insight into whether or not they would like in person or remote classes. Any other comments? Let me just make sure that I kind of went through everything. Okay, it seems like we covered all of the comments, and it seems like you guys kind of like gauged how to kind of put together an unbiased opinion. So I'm going to clean this up and then hopefully send it out or provide kind of like a cleaned up document if you guys ever want to refer to this. But I think we're going to go into some like questions and answers now. Just anything that we had with respect to product management or the exercise that was just done. So there was a question on Slido. What are the typical interview challenges, questions, or activities you have received as a PM? That's a really good question. So I've had quite a few product management interviews, but they're more internship interviews. And I think it really varies based on the company. So sometimes companies will primarily ask or like start off with like really behavioral questions. When we talk about like interviews, kind of like the same thing, tell me about yourself. And kind of the behavioral questions. And then for product focused questions, they can be like design focused, they can be estimation, or they can be like personal opinion product questions. So for example, an example of a personal opinion one would be like describe your favorite product, either like a software product or a hardware product. And then you kind of have to go through and talk about like from a product management perspective, why that product is your favorite. When we talk about design questions, there are questions such as build a alarm clock for the elderly customer segment, and you kind of have to go through the design process of talking about how you would build it, why you would build it that way, kind of talking about the different pain points, etc. And then estimation questions are more like math like. So how much would it cost to feed the entire North American continent? And then you kind of have to go through like estimation based on like the numbers you currently know, the populations, and then kind of like do a quantitative analysis, kind of like in front of them. So those are like the three main categories of interview questions that I've gotten. There's a ton of frameworks online and a ton of books, cracking the PM interview. There's Decode and Conquer, but there's the books kind of touch on like the different kind of interview questions that you could potentially get. For indie developers, is it important to conduct research interviews, or does it only matter at a larger scale? That's a really good question. So I think that when we talk about like customer interviews, different companies will do them differently. So a larger company may tie in more quantitative analysis that kind of complements something like a customer interview, which is like qualitative analysis. So maybe they'll do like A/B testing, or they'll do something with like a large amount of users to kind of figure out what their next steps would be. But I think at all stages and all sizes of organizations, I think customer interviews are super important. It kind of helps you gauge a level of like awareness of your customer, helps you gain background information, but also like the recommendations and the conversations that you have could allow you to like get things that you would have missed in like a quantitative analysis. So I think that like not only for big companies, but I think it's like especially good for small companies as well, because sometimes you can't do that quantitative analysis because you don't have that much reach for many users. So directly talking to customers is kind of like how you're going to have to do like your product management and your research. Are PMs the ones asking the questions, or do they frame the questions and give them to someone on the team? I think that's very dependent on the organization. So I've done it in a way where like I created the research plan and I asked the questions. So I kind of did the whole process start to end. Some organizations, I think bigger organizations, will have like a research team. So you'll work with the research team to kind of like put together the questions. And I think the research team will be very aware of like bias. They're not in your product. And as a product manager, sometimes you may be like very heavily involved in your project that you can't see the bias you're saying in some of the questions. So I think in bigger organizations, you'll probably be paired with like a research expert or like a study group to kind of like put the study plan together and conduct the interview. It just depends on the organization. Any other questions about anything, product management, the customer interview? Okay. I think that if there's no more questions, we can begin to close out the workshop. Please make sure to answer the feedback poll. You can ask any other questions in the Discord. Make sure to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm free to answer any questions that you guys might have. Thank you so much for joining, and best of luck with the rest of the hackathon.